Hey folks, Brian Bledsoe once again with your May update for Red Summit Rangeland Insurance. Lots to talk about as we always have. So let's go ahead and dive into how things have been transpiring over the last 30 days or so. And there hasn't been a whole lot of change in this overall pattern, except the wetter areas have gotten wetter. Obviously, eastern Montana through parts of the Dakotas, Minnesota, down into north central Nebraska. And then you have another bullseye from southeast Kansas, eastern Oklahoma over toward the Mississippi River. Now, if you haven't been in those locations, chances are you haven't had a whole lot of moisture. And some of the areas that have been dry, southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, and back to the west and southwest, have been dry for now quite some time. But because the weather pattern hasn't been changing a whole lot due to how things are kind of locked in the Pacific Ocean, it's really been about the haves and the have-nots in terms of moisture. And the western part of the country is in the same boat. Eastern, or I should say western Washington, western Oregon, northwest California has been fairly soggy. Parts of Montana, down in the south central part, Idaho, Wyoming. But if you go south and southeast of that line, it has been very, very few and far between in terms of moisture producing storms. In fact, many areas from Colorado down into Arizona, New Mexico had their driest April on record. That kind of gives you an idea of the extreme nature of the way the La Nina has been going. Speaking of which, here's an animation from early April to early May of the sea surface temperature anomalies. And I want you to know a few things on how they've changed. Now, the La Nina is that blue area right there along the equatorial Pacific Ocean off the west coast of South America. That's going gangbusters as it has been. But also notice the blue water up there over the Gulf of Alaska and off the west coast of North America and down toward the Baja. That area has been getting colder over the past month or so. And specifically, the area of water that has gotten the coldest, the fastest, has been right off the west coast of the United States and almost reaching back down to near Hawaii. That is a very unfavorable signal as we head towards summertime if you're trying to erase a drought in much of the plain states. And I don't see that changing a whole lot going forward, meaning I think maybe this particular phase of this La Nina may have peaked out and we'll kind of relax it a little bit over the next couple of months, but I don't see it going away. In fact, if anything, this thing will probably come back in a stronger fashion as we head into the fall. So you see what these blue bars are. They're probabilities of La Nina hanging around. And you see right now where we are. We're obviously in La Nina. And then they briefly drop below 50%, only to come right back above 50% by the time we head toward fall and winter. So do I think a triple dip La Nina is in store for us? I'd be shocked if it wasn't at this point, considering how chilly that water is out there. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation is in a cold or negative phase, which kind of fuels that. It makes it very reluctant to change. So I think we're probably going to be talking about La Nina and having a similar conversation about this off and on over the next several months. The other thing that's been going on is while the La Nina has weakened just a little bit, and by way of those easterly trade winds running along the equator has weakened some, there is a little bit of a change that's taking place here. You see up here in the center part of the graph, you see the blues and the greens and then the reds over here. That's the winds at in that part of the world, right there in the central part of the western part of the Pacific, coming together, okay? They're converging. That's where you have the best rising motion. The best rising motion has been taking place over in Indonesia. It hasn't been able to move across the Pacific Ocean. But if you come down the graph, you see the blues getting lighter, you see the oranges and the reds getting lighter. That's those trade winds weakening somewhat. And with the weakening of the trade winds, that may allow the MJO to cycle a little bit here. And the MJO, from a model perspective, at least this first one, does show, you see all those yellow lines kind of popping out of the center and going through 5, 6, 7, and maybe collapsing over in phase 8 in a weak cycle with this particular model. Now, the Euro model has the same story. It's a much stronger signal. And there is some uncertainty as to what happens over here in phase 7 and phase 8. But for right now, because those easterly trade winds are weakening, that does allow the MJO to have a better chance to actually cycle. I wish it would have cycled in such a way about a month ago, and I think we would have a better chance of getting some folks that are dry, much better moisture. But historically speaking, as we look at the composites here, this time of year, when the MJO's in these particular phases, phase 6 and 7, at least for the center part of the country, and 8 are usually pretty good. However, I'm not necessarily so sure we're going to see that type of an uptick in terms of precipitation. And I'll show you the reason why here in just a second. From a temperature standpoint, look, I think we're going to favor fairly warmer than average conditions in the nation's midsection, and we'll kind of keep cooler than average the farther north and northwest you go. So I think we'll probably live somewhere here in phase 6 for a little while longer, especially given the way the weather pattern has evolved and hung around in this particular fashion. From a modeling perspective, we can analyze that too. And what we'll do is look at the next 15 days in terms of moisture anomalies here. And you can see that's what we have right there from the Euro model. Again, the areas that are wet stay wet from eastern Montana through the northern plains, and the areas that have been drier than average remain drier than average, especially the farther south you go. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to have thunderstorm chances here in the plains occasionally. It just means that the tip toward drier than average is much greater than that tip toward wetter than average in those areas. And also, it's going to get fairly warm here. Look at these over the next 10 days. We're seeing those oranges and reds. Temperature anomalies are going to be about 7 to 13 degrees above average over the next 10 days. And that is definitely an early dose of summertime that a lot of folks in that part of the world do not want right now. Now, the western part of the country, it's pretty much the same. Next 15 days, those areas that have been wet probably stay somewhat wet. Those areas that have been dry stay somewhat drier than average too. But it's also the same way in terms of temperature. You can see those areas that have been cooler than average, the Pacific Northwest, the Northwest Rockies, yeah, they're probably going to stay that way and let all the heat swelter out here into the plains. Again, when the ocean temperatures are stacked this way, it makes it very difficult for the weather pattern to change. And this model over the next 35 days is indicating the same thing. Some pretty serious rainfall deficits here in the plains. If this plays out and going into the summer season where it's getting hot, that is definitely not something that they want to see in that particular area, because it's also going to get hot. This is the next 35 days. Temperature anomalies running anywhere from 5 to 9 degrees above average here across southwest Kansas, the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles, eastern New Mexico, and all the way down into Texas. So the heat, I think, is going to be a fixture in the forecast, especially for the plains, versus the farther west you go for the next 35 days. Again, a similar precipitation outlook from what we've been seeing. And in terms of temperature, I actually think we can see that relax a little bit. That cooler than average stuff is still going to be there, just maybe not as aggressive as the next 15 days or so, but certainly the heat setting up shop across parts of the Four Corner states and definitely points eastward once you get out on the plains. The next 45 days, very similar setup. And while this may be a touch overdone here, all of this red in the nation's midsection, those are rainfall deficits running from 1.5 inches to about 4.25 inches below average. This is kind of what we've been talking about, over the past few months of this particular pattern setting up in the nation's midsection, because La Nina was going to continue into the summer, and that cold PDO, and again, that cooler than average water off the West Coast, I cannot stress that enough, really drives the ship with something like this. And it also drives the heat over the next 45 days. You see a very similar signal to what I was showing you in terms of heat with those previous models. Precipitation anomalies farther west, again, starts to dry out. For those areas that had been a little bit wetter than average, it starts to dry out. And with the heat of summer setting in and you're drying things out, I would imagine that the timber fire season is probably going to be going gangbusters. Parts of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, all the way up here to Wyoming, and maybe up here into parts of Idaho and western Montana. We'll have to see how that kind of shakes out. But from a modeling perspective, at least over the next month and a half, I don't see a whole lot of change in terms of how this is going to evolve. Now, the NMME model for June, July, August, this is the new one, doesn't show really a terribly different scenario here. You see all the brown, the drier than average conditions here across Texas, New Mexico, and on up into the western high plains, but that also extends up here into the Pacific Northwest and the Northwest Rockies during that time frame. Why is it white in Arizona and western New Mexico, parts of Colorado? I think the monsoon season is going to be kicking in there, and some of the models are indicating it could be somewhat robust. So if we look at that signal here with the Euro seasonal model, which is my next graphic, you'll see that trend that starts to take place where you're dry central and northwest, and then down here over Arizona, New Mexico, you see some green show up where you have a tip toward average to wetter than average conditions because of that monsoon season setting up. And if we look on a little different vantage point here that takes you farther west, it's a very similar signal, okay? The only difference between the Euro seasonal model and the NMME was you have a little bit better green showing up there across parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, courtesy of that monsoon season that's going to get going. So with the way things are in the oceans, you can pick out some analogs of years past and project going forward. With the way things are right now, if you take the same set of ingredients and you go backward and you look at various years that had similar ingredients, I've got those listed right up here for you: 88, 99, 02, 06, 12, and 13. This is the map that you get in terms of precipitation anomalies, where you're dry central and northwest, and you fire up the monsoon down there across Arizona and New Mexico. And from what I've shown you model-wise, what I've shown you from a current state of affairs in terms of soil moisture and where the weather pattern's been, and then you throw these analogs onto it, I don't have a whole lot of reason to argue against with what the meteorological forensics, if you will, are pointing us in that direction. And this is the temperature anomalies from those particular years too, which are pretty toasty in the nation's midsection and across the northern plains. So again, could this change? Sure. But will it? Again, I'm very suspect because of the reasons that I've laid out for you for the past few months and also in this particular video. So if you have questions, we have a webinar coming up here. I believe it's on the 19th. We can address those in more detail, and I'll have a little bit of additional new information in the next, say, week and a half or so. But bottom line, this is what we're looking at right now, and it's very important that we watch those ocean temperatures off the west coast of North America. If they change a little bit, well, maybe that changes the situation a little bit here in the midsection of the country. But if they don't, it's looking pretty hot and pretty dry for the summertime in those areas. I'll have another update for you, as I said, in that webinar coming up here in a few days. In the meantime, if you have any questions, be sure to drop me a line. Until next time we talk, have a good time, folks.